All right, let's jump right into it. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're unpacking a highly complex, dual-layered crisis that struck the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela on the evening of June 24th, 2026. What we're looking at here isn't just your standard natural disaster. No, it's a massive geological catastrophe that collided head-on with a massive geopolitical realignment. We're going to explore how the Earth literally fractured right beneath a nation that was right in the middle of a super fragile political transition. 39. Just 39 seconds. That's it. That is the exact amount of time it took to turn a localized geological event into an absolute national catastrophe. I mean, in just over half a minute, the Earth's crust ruptured twice, testing a fragile brand new government in ways that, honestly, nobody could have predicted. Now, to understand how 39 seconds could possibly cause such widespread devastation, we first have to look deep underground. And that brings us to Section 1, the catalyst, the 39-second seismic doublet. Okay, so let's zoom way into the microscopic kinetic level of what happened on June 24. Venezuela actually sits right on a highly active tectonic boundary. Specifically, we're talking about the Boconó-Morón-El Pilar Fault System. Right here, the Caribbean plate is just relentlessly grinding eastward against the South American plate at a rate of 20 millimeters, that's about 0.8 inches, every single year. So it's this incredibly broad, highly strained deformation zone. And on June 24, all that pent-up kinetic energy just violently snapped. It triggered what seismologists call a rare seismic doublet. Basically, a doublet happens when an initial rupture instantly transfers an unmanageable amount of stress over to a neighboring fault segment that's already under pressure. That adjacent segment simply can't handle the sudden, massive burden, so it immediately fails too. It's literally a 1-2 punch of pure kinetic energy. Now, the timeline of these strikes created a perfect storm. Event 1, the foreshock hits at a massive 7.2 magnitude near Unimare, and then, just 39 seconds later, Event 2, the mainshock, hits at an even stronger 7.5 magnitude near Morón. But the true devastation here, it all came down to the depth. See, the foreshock was roughly 20 to 22 kilometers down, but that 7.5 mainshock, that ruptured at a much shallower depth of exactly 10 kilometers. In seismology, shallow earthquakes are vastly more destructive simply because the energy has less distance to travel before it hits the surface. So any infrastructure that was just weakened or fractured by the 7.2 foreshock was instantly subjected to the violent, shallow shaking of the 7.5 mainshock well before any settling or evacuation could possibly happen. The mechanics of that shaking are absolutely crucial. The June 24 doublet was a strike-slip event. That means the ground displaced horizontally, basically tearing the Earth side to side rather than thrusting it up and down. This kind of horizontal tearing generates these high-frequency seismic waves that are just notoriously destructive to unreinforced buildings. But here's a really surprising scientific fact. Despite the massive kinetic energy released right near the coast, this horizontal motion is exactly why the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center ultimately concluded that no destructive tsunami was generated. You see, you need massive vertical displacement of the ocean floor to create a tsunami, and this sideways tearing just didn't do it.
That shifts us right into Section 2, the fallout, cascading infrastructural collapse.
So, zooming out to the regional level to look at the physical and humanitarian impact, the timing could not have been worse. The initial rupture hit at exactly 1804 local time. The streets were bustling, people were commuting, the urban centers were densely packed. The devastation in the capital city of Caracas was profound. But you might be wondering, why was Caracas hit so incredibly hard when the epicenters were over 160 kilometers away? Well, it comes down to topography. The capital sits in a unique topographical basin that effectively trapped, resonated, and amplified those destructive seismic waves, almost like a bowl sloshing water around. In the Baruta district, we saw the complete collapse of 2 multi-story buildings and severe landslides, leaving 3 dead. In Chacao, 4 buildings suffered total pancake collapses, with 1 death and 22 hospitalized. And in the upmarket Altamira district, at least 3 major structures, including a 6-floor residential building, collapsed entirely, which required intense rescue operations. But the capital wasn't the only zone of extreme failure. We have to talk about a terrifying secondary hazard that the USGS actually warned about: liquefaction. This happens when saturated soils temporarily lose their mechanical strength and basically start behaving like a liquid during intense shaking. This severely threatened the coastal disaster zone of La Guaira. The shaking literally liquefied the ground beneath heavy structures, completely destroying key landmarks like the Naval Academy in Katia Lamar and Edwards Hotel Boutique. And this coastal destruction led to a critical logistical nightmare. The Simón Bolívar International Airport in Maiquetía had to be closed indefinitely. Terminal corridors were dealing with falling debris and major structural fracturing. Why does this matter so much? Because this airport is the nation's primary aerial gateway. Its closure immediately created a severe logistical bottleneck. It essentially prevented heavy international aid, specialized search and rescue teams, and vital medical cargo from safely landing when they were needed the absolute most. Beyond just the airport, the systemic lifeline disruptions were staggering. The Caracas metro and train networks were completely halted. We saw massive systemic internet drops and localized power grid failures that plunged the disaster zones into total darkness. On top of that, Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello ordered preemptive natural gas shutoffs. Now, while this was a vital, totally necessary step to prevent post-earthquake urban fires, which, by the way, can be just as deadly as the quakes themselves, the lack of power, gas, and telecommunications drastically hindered emergency operations. It left trapped civilians completely unable to call for help. Which brings us to a very grim statistic: 100,000. In the immediate aftermath, the interim government reported 32 confirmed fatalities. But the United States Geological Survey rapidly issued a red pager alert. Their predictive modeling, which is based on the exposure of a highly vulnerable population to violent shaking, projected that the final casualty figures could ultimately reach anywhere between 10,000 and 100,000 people. It's just a staggering discrepancy, and it really underscores the sheer scale of the humanitarian emergency unfolding in the rubble. A disaster of this scale would push any nation to the brink. This brings us to Section 3, the state, a fragile transitional government. We absolutely have to view this disaster against the national political backdrop, because this earthquake represents the very first existential test for the interim government and acting President Delcy Rodríguez. The geopolitical upheaval leading up to this moment is just incredible. Back in September 2025, there was a precursor quake. Then, on January 3, 2026, the U.S. military executed Operation Absolute Resolve, resulting in the removal of Nicolás Maduro and Delcy Rodríguez stepping in as acting president. Just weeks later, on January 29, her government passed a landmark oil privatization law to deregulate the sector and invite foreign investment. And then, a mere 6 months into this highly delicate, brand-new political era, the seismic doublet strikes on June 24. Beyond the physical rubble, there is a massive economic threat looming here. The USGS projected infrastructural losses equal to 1% to 4% of Venezuela's entire gross domestic product. Prior to this, the interim government was riding a wave of sanction-free economic recovery, really hoping newly acquired oil revenues could revitalize the country. Now this massive financial loss threatens to completely bottleneck those recovery efforts, effectively forcing the state to divert its liquid capital away from long-term industrial rebuilding and purely into basic humanitarian survival. So to manage this overwhelming crisis, the government had to make a really critical operational choice. The civilian emergency services were immediately overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the collapsed infrastructure. In response, acting President Rodríguez heavily leveraged military deployment, specifically appointing General Juan Ernesto Silberán Quintero to lead the National Guard in the recovery. Now, this isn't just about clearing rubble from arterial roads. This civil-military coordination serves a dual purpose. It actively projects domestic legitimacy, order, and state capacity, which is absolutely vital for a transitional government trying to prove to its people that it can protect them following a profound political upheaval. And that leads us to our final section today, Section 4, the globe, global disaster diplomacy. The way the world reacted to this newly installed government during a crisis is fascinating to watch. The international response is inextricably linked to the geopolitical realignment of the entire Western Hemisphere. The United States, for instance, signaled a dramatic shift in tone. Over on Truth Social, U.S. President Donald Trump declared the U.S. was ready, willing, and able to help our new and great friends. Having orchestrated the removal of the previous regime just months prior, the U.S. used this moment to signal a definitive, public end to decades of hemispheric hostility. This directive prompted rapid, high-visibility mobilization from U.S. State Department officials like Marco Rubio, Jeremy P. Lewin, and Laura Dogu, who started pushing specialized urban search and rescue teams toward Caracas. And keep in mind, this wasn't happening in a vacuum. On June 9, 2026, just a couple of weeks before the earthquake hit, there was actually a joint U.S.-Venezuelan military strike targeting the Tren de Aragua leader, Niño Guerrero, deep in the Amazon. So the security and operational integration between Washington and Caracas was already cementing itself well before the seismic disaster. Accepting vast amounts of heavy U.S. disaster relief only deepens this new strategic alliance. But
this disaster diplomacy extended far beyond just Washington. Nations that were fiercely adversarial to the Maduro administration just months ago rapidly stepped up to offer unconditional support. El Salvador, under Nayib Bukele, offered 300 rescuers, paramedics, and 50 tons of equipment. Mexico prepared specialist teams per Venezuela's direct request, and Brazil mobilized its foreign ministry to coordinate assistance. Basically, the shared tragedy provided an avenue for the new Venezuelan government to normalize its standing among its South and Central American peers.
I think Ecuador's President Daniel Noboa captured the moment perfectly, stating, "Humanity must always guide, despite our enormous differences." It was a rare, genuine moment of regional unity. Global multilateral organizations like the IFRC, the Red Cross, and the UN immediately mobilized to establish emergency shelters and assess needs, while leaders as far away as India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi publicly pledged all possible help.
Which leaves us with a massive question for you to consider. Will this disaster fracture a fragile new government, or will it permanently cement its place in a new global order? The stakes literally couldn't be higher here. If the delivery of foreign aid is slow, or if it feels overly managed by foreign militaries, it could spark a fierce nationalist backlash, giving rival political factions room to challenge the acting president. But if this rapid, well-coordinated international recovery succeeds, it might just permanently validate Venezuela's pivot toward a U.S.-aligned strategic orbit, forging a completely new future out of the rubble. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.